I am Michael Vlahos. I am here today in the library of the illustrious Army-Navy Club in Washington, D.C., the Imperial City, um, with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, United States Army retired, to talk about the war in Ukraine. A word about me. I have taught war and strategy variously since 1980 at the NHTSA School SAIS and the Johns Hopkins University here in DC, and for some years at the Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island, and at the Centro de Estudios Superiores Navales, the Mexican War College in El Ciudad de Mexico. I've also served in the CIA as a senior executive in the State Department and with the Navy. Colonel Macgregor is one of the most renowned American soldiers of the latter part of the 20th century. He is currently the last officer to lead an armored cavalry squadron in tank-to-tank combat at the Battle of 73 Easting during Desert Storm. Colonel Macgregor is a national champion of military reform and perhaps the most important thinker on American combat power and grand strategy currently writing today. His most recent book, Margin of Victory, will frame much of our conversation. The war in Ukraine is still raging after 9 months and 10 days. First and foremost, we should remember that the war is the creation and indeed the culmination of a long-standing and aggressive U.S. policy of NATO expansion into former Soviet states, especially Ukraine. The backstory of this war is there for everyone to see, laid bare by lectures and interviews of John Mearsheimer, the writing of Jim Goldgeier on promises we made to Boris Yeltsin, and archives released detailing U.S. government representations to Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet premier. So therefore today, in contrast, we want to talk about the more recent past, present, and future of this war. Accordingly, this will be a conversation like a concerto or a sonata of 3 parts or movements. First, what does the war tell us? What has happened? Where are we now? Second, why has NATO failed so strongly at the strategic level? And look at a proxy war effectively run on denial and deceit. And third, finally, what is to be done and where do we go from here? So, what does the war tell us? What has happened? Where are we now? Colonel Macgregor, it's such a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. And let's start off at the beginning. What was the original conception of the special military operation in terms of its goals and the net assessment that allowed Putin to initiate it?
Yeah, I think President Putin decided that all of his efforts to talk us into some level of understanding had failed. And having failed to persuade us that Russia would not tolerate NATO membership for Ukraine and would not tolerate the eventual positioning of NATO forces, especially NATO missiles, long-range strike weapons in eastern Ukraine, led him to conclude he had to go in and demonstrate just how serious he was. I think he made a number of assumptions about how this would work out that turned out to be invalid. One of his assumptions was that the United States in particular, the leadership in Washington, as well as the leadership in Kyiv, would want to negotiate, that they would want to avoid a wider war. I don't think he was prepared for what turned out to be the opposite. So the first going in proposition was, we're going in with limited numbers of troops. We're going a short distance into eastern Ukraine, principally into those areas where the majority of the population speaks Russian. And we plan to demonstrate that we are serious and we want to negotiate. And he outlines certain things that he wanted. Number one, obviously, Ukraine had to be neutral, not a member of NATO. Neutrality. Right. Didn't go into great detail about what that neutrality would mean, but probably something close to Austria or Finland. Secondly, he thought, well, there are two provinces that are, or oblasts, whatever you want to call them, that are breakaway, Donetsk and Luhansk, and they should have the right to live as Russians inside Ukraine, have equal rights as Russians, as Ukrainian citizens, enjoy some measure of autonomy. And then, of course, there's the issue of Crimea. Please recognize the legitimacy of Russian control of Crimea, which, from the standpoint of the Russians, having conquered it in the 1770s, is a self-evident truth. Now, in addition to that, he also talked about eventually having a Russian representative sit on the equivalent of the Ukrainian National Security Council,
right,
simply as a representative of Russian interests to that Security Council. That's about it.
So he would have been not happy, but satisfied with that as an outcome.
Yes, and I think he was quite surprised that there was no real willingness to seriously consider it. Now, we do have evidence towards the end of March, after the war had been going on for 6 weeks,
right,
that Mr. Zelensky said, well, we could live with neutrality. And when that word seems to have reached Washington and London,
Boris Johnson,
people became incensed, and Boris Johnson represented Washington's interests and said, absolutely not. We will support you to the bitter end. You must stand your ground and fight for every inch of Ukraine.
Well, apropos of this, why did Mr. Putin believe that this would work? The U.S. had been training up essentially a ersatz NATO force, the second strongest army in Europe after Russia, up to NATO standards, and had spent billions on this enterprise. Now, why would Putin not take that into account?
I think there are several reasons. First of all, Vladimir Putin, unlike his predecessors, really does know something about the West.
Right.
If we go back through many Soviet and Russian leaders over centuries, very few had actually traveled outside of their homeland. That's not the case with Vladimir Putin. And he is predisposed to cooperate with the West, not just on a business level, but also in a cultural sense.
His record shows that.
Yeah, so that was part of it. Secondly, he did not want to convey the impression that there was anything Soviet-like about the current state. And so he was not going to send forces into Ukraine that would be destructive.
You mean like Hungary in 56?
Of course. And he gave strict orders to the forces that went in there. I don't want you to kill civilians.
Yeah.
I want you to minimize losses in the civilian population. Try not to destroy infrastructure. And I think his assumption was that we would somehow or another figure out what his intentions were. We were never really interested in his intentions. In fact, from our vantage point, I think we thought this war was manna from heaven. That this was a war that this new Ukrainian army that we'd invested so heavily in could win. And we mistook, the underlying assumptions that shaped the initial operation as evidence for weakness.
So the initial operation that was supposed to be completed within a few weeks turned out to be, in effect, the initial phase of a longer war. And at what point did the Russians and Mr. Putin realize that the Ukrainians, being persuaded to fight what amounts to, from their perspective, total war, did Russia decide to recalibrate?
That's a question that's tough to answer without seeing the
of course.
Actual transcripts of the meetings that were conducted. But we know that in April and May, there were several meetings and several discussions, because the feedback that was coming from Ukraine, from the Russians living in Ukraine, was very interesting. Because the Russian troops told them, well, we're here to liberate you, but we're not staying. And so the Russian-speaking population said, well, if you're not going to stay, as soon as you leave, if we cooperate with you, the Ukrainian secret police that we call the SBU will come here, shoot all of us in the head.
And this happened.
Yeah, so if you're not going to stay, literally, the hell with you. We're not going to support it. This became increasingly obvious as the war drew on, and that was the first thing. The second thing was we sent very hostile signals. You go back to March and listen to President Biden's speech,
Yeah.
which was the famous regime change speech,
Right.
by accident, that until Putin is removed and this state is transformed into something that meets our standards,
Right.
there can be no peace. And I think it took a while for that to sink in. And suddenly, by the beginning of the summer, it was very clear that what they had done would not secure Russia.
So what you're describing is not something that Americans really understand. Is that when the initial phase essentially ran into a brick wall, there was a transitional period of maybe 6 to 8 weeks in which the Russians recalibrated and reassessed their situation. And then from what we've discussed, they went into a strategic defensive mode in which they held the territory they'd taken in the south, consolidated it by taking Mariupol and then the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk conurbation, and manned it with a relatively small force, a kind of economy of force operation.
Yes, they never had more than 20% of their ground force engaged.
Right.
That is a very small contingent, about 190,000 troops initially. And then it became clear that that was going to be inadequate because the war was not going to end with the capture of these territories.
Right.
So there, at some point in the summer, there was a meeting between the General Staff, the Stavka, and I think President Putin. And his question was, well, what do we have to do to win this war and end it?
Right.
Because the key issue is not just we want to win on the battlefield, we want to win in such a way as we bring this war to a close.
Right, and although severe casualties had been inflicted on the Ukrainian army, or, the original Ukrainian army, the U.S. and Britain were very active in training and equipping new cadre of Ukrainian into effective forces, and this began to be demonstrated in the end of August and into September and October.
Well, people were always shown these marvelous films of Russian tanks being destroyed by various things, Javelin missiles, and of course the one weapon system the British are using, this light anti-tank weapon system, which is really very, very good. It's turned out to be much more effective
than
than the Javelin, based on the reports coming in. And the Russians looked at all of this and said, well, Mr. President, if you want us to win this and bring this to a close, we have to make fundamental change in all of the assumptions.
Right.
And first and foremost, we have to move over to the strategic defensive. And this is going to have to be, for the time being, an economy of force operation because we don't have enough forces. Not only are you going to have to bring in most of the regular army, the active force, we're going to need additional reservists and volunteers. What's really interesting on the Russian side is the enormous success which they've had with volunteers, not just Chechnya, but also within Russia itself. So this changed the character, but then the decision was, well, if we're going to hold this territory, and this is when Surovikin is named the new commander, he said, I'm happy to hold this territory, but I don't want to be committed to holding every inch of this.
Right.
If I feel it's necessary to withdraw somewhere to economize so that I could be more successful elsewhere, I want to be able to do that. And President Putin said, you are now the theater commander. You are in command. Everyone takes orders from you. So there was a restructuring of the commands to ensure that he was now the final say on any operational item that occurred in the theater. That was not the case earlier.
So the second phase, which was marked initially by an adaptation to the circumstances that the Russians found themselves in, actually evolved during the course of this phase into something more productive than simply holding the line.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is somewhat reminiscent to me of the withdrawal of the German army, which was also outnumbered in World War I, to the so-called Hindenburg Line in 1917, where what the Russians did, the Germans, did is leave a barren wasteland, that was full of obstacles and mines, and pull back to a position that shortened the front and allowed them to build up a larger strategic reserve. And it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that Surovikin sort of deliberately did this in both the part of the Kharkiv Oblast and also
Yes.
in Kherson Oblast.
Yeah, well, the Russians have an advantage, though, over us in this sense. They understand that ground in and of itself has no real value unless it confers a military advantage on you.
Right.
There's no point in just holding onto ground for the sake of saying, well, here on the map I've drawn a line and I'll go no further, which of course was the Hitlerian mistake that lost the war in the East, or one of them. And the bottom line is, he said, look, we're not going to defend something that we can easily retake when we decide it's necessary. We're going to stay where we think we can defend effectively. And so for weeks I was being asked by people, well, the Russians withdrew 10 kilometers here, they withdrew 20 here, and so aren't they in retreat? Is this not evidence for Russian decay and a crumbling defense? Never. It never was. But all of these things were approved by Surovikin. He made it very clear that local commanders had authority to do what made sense, but he was still in command, and these decisions had to be checked with him.
Well, what's interesting is this development during the second phase actually turned into a bonus that would help prepare the way for the third phase, which was the development of through mobilization, through a unified command, through preparation of the battlefield, a good layout of the land for the fourth phase, which would be the actual offensive.
Well, before we leave this second phase, I think it's useful to point out that Surovikin is in a position not very different from Montgomery during World War II.
Right.
Americans usually scorn Field Marshal Montgomery based on this ridiculous Patton movie, which was unfair to Montgomery. Montgomery's actually a very competent officer, but Montgomery was very sensitive to minimizing his casualties. And when Surovikin took over, he made it very clear he would not countenance any frontal assaults. He was not going to waste lives unnecessarily. And I think he got the same level of trust and confidence from Putin that Montgomery got from Churchill. You can do whatever you want. I will give you all the material necessary, and we will do what you say, and we will attack when you're ready. And I think Surovikin is the sort of man that said, I'm not making a move until all of the conditions are met that I think are essential to guarantee successful offensive operations.
Well, could we go through each of the elements of shaping the battlefield? So the third phase quite clearly has been one of mobilization, building up forces, levying attrition on Ukrainian forces to weaken them, perhaps fatally. And then there's also preparation of the battlefield for the offensive. Could you just go through those?
Well, I think if you talk about intelligence preparation of the battlefield, the Russians are not going to make the mistake that they made before they went into eastern Ukraine.
Right.
In other words, they're not going to assume that they're going to enjoy support without commitments that they're prepared to make to the population.
Yeah.
They also understand that infrastructure is important, but not all infrastructure. And they also want to make absolutely certain that they are going to annihilate most of what passes for air defense before they begin this offensive. And that's also, by the way, very reminiscent of the Allies during World War II, that went to great lengths to strip away as much as possible the German Air Force. And then finally, I think the buildup of supplies and ammunition, the pre-positioning of medical support, all of those things have been happening, and Surovikin has been personally involved in it. He and Putin, by the way, have actually gone down to the troop level to look at how these reservists are being equipped. Do they have the right winter clothing? Do they have the right set of equipment? Do they have the adequate training? This has been a very thorough process. And what he wants to know at some point is, first of all, is the transportation infrastructure now at a standstill? Have we attacked all the fuel and ammunition storage points?
Right.
Have we eliminated the power grid for all intents and purposes, forcing people to flee because, frankly, from their vantage point, the fewer civilians they have to deal with, the better.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, to their credit, and they never get credit for this, they always bring food and medicine with them
I know.
when they move into these areas and distribute it.
There's ample demonstration of that.
And no one carries this in the West
Right,
because we're
right.
busy maintaining this narrative of the evil Russians.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things are being carefully examined. And when he's satisfied that in each of these categories, I'm sure he probably has a chart somewhere. You know, we sometimes did it in the Pentagon as red, green, or yellow.
Yeah, I know.
He may have something similar to that. Has this condition been met?
Right.
When all of those are met, and of course we're talking about weather, which is no small consideration in that part of the world. And I know that they have been waiting for things to freeze, and they just haven't gotten there yet in the deep south.
No, you had said at one point to me that it would take 2 weeks
Yes.
at the end of the Rasputitsa for the ground to thoroughly freeze. So you said to a level of
Right.
3 or 4 feet.
But now, having said that, we have to go back and re-examine this economy of force mission,
Right.
which has turned into something much more than an economy of force mission.
Yeah.
They discovered that they could actually induce the Ukrainians to launch counterattacks against them.
It's true.
And this is the issue that we don't really appreciate in the ground force. We don't appreciate this coupling of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance,
Right.
with strike weaponry. Not just artillery in the conventional sense, but
Yes.
everything that falls into the standoff attack category. And the Russians have a lot of experience with this. Certainly in World War II, there's this famous event when they had surrounded 50,000 German troops outside of Minsk, which I cover in the book. Zhukov, as an Army front commander, was able to say, I want every aircraft available, immediately scrambled to attack the Germans in this encirclement. Within minutes, thousands of Soviet aircraft, bombers, fighter bombers began arriving and pulverizing the Germans. And by this time in the war, they were surrounded by armor, tanks, and artillery, so the Germans couldn't get out, which historically they'd been able to escape.
Yeah. Like
Well, if you fast forward,
pockets.
if you fast forward in this
Capacity
process,
pocket,
if you fast forward to the present, there are examples of cruise missiles being launched within minutes from the Black Sea, from vessels down there, to strike targets in Ukraine as far north as Kharkov, where there were Ukrainian artillery and anti-tank positions that could not be reached by any other means. And it was done within minutes. There was no lengthy debate with the Air Force. There was no lengthy targeting discussion. It was done.
So
simply.
the productive attrition, both of logistical capability, but also of the forces themselves, is really taking advantage of a period during Rasputitsa where the Russians have to wait. They're preparing the battlefield. And would it be too much to say that the Russians have taken advantage of their famous Maskirovka because they've been handed a sort of a receptive West that is willing to believe that the Russians are on the run, haven't really. I have seen no assessments, apart from you, of the buildup of Russian forces being discussed in the Western media. So in effect, the Western media is handing the Russians the benefit of a big surprise moment by being unwilling to talk about what's actually happening.
Well, I think you could say those things. I'm not sure that we could attribute it to Maskirovka. This is this is a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah, I agree.
But the key thing here, and this is something we discussed earlier today with Roger, and that was see two opponents, one Russian, one Ukrainian, sitting on either side of a chessboard. Each side can largely see what the other has.
Right.
This is something we haven't really confronted in the past. There's not much happening on the Russian side that we cannot monitor with space-based surveillance and all the technologies at the National Security Agency, and all of this information is then fed to the Ukrainians on a routine basis. And we have thousands of contractors, former soldiers, and undoubtedly NATO staffs at lower levels taking advantage of this. But what the Russians did not expect, and this has worked to their advantage, is that they would be foolish enough to launch attack after attack after attack for political reasons, to try and demonstrate that there was life left in the Ukrainian armed forces.
Well, that's sort of a projection.
And if you look at Bakhmut,
what we feel.
If you look at Bakhmut right now, this is the topic in the press right now. Bakhmut is being portrayed as a strategically vital logistical hub, rail, everything. And if it is lost, that conceivably that could unhinge the strategic or operational
Right.
defense in southern Ukraine. I don't know if that's all true, but what we do know is that the Russians have simply held the cheese out for the mice
Yes.
and said, please come in
Yes.
and defend Bakhmut. So they've held back from actually capturing it in the hopes that more troops would be introduced. They just introduced another 20,000 into Bakhmut a few days ago, half of whom are not Ukrainians. Thousands of Poles, Americans, British, and so forth.
I've heard that the Poles have suffered 5,000 casualties.
I know that these are unofficial reports coming to me from people on the ground in Poland that have relatives in Poland and in Ukraine, and they say as many as 1,000 Polish soldiers may have died.
Wow, that would jive with 5,000 casualties.
But this of course is a gift to the Russians, and what's happened now with the economy of force is that the morale down there has risen dramatically,
Right.
because soldiers are always much happier when they see damage inflicted on the enemy. So instead of simply sitting there and waiting for someone to attack, they've managed to manipulate the battlefield.
Yeah.
And with this ISR strike capability, do enormous damage.
Well, let's look just at the near term. It's very hard to look ahead. Those who do it usually get burned and chastised for it. But let's look weeks or maybe a month ahead and talk about what the war termination operation that the Russians hope to launch might look like and what its objectives would be. Not that we know anything about what would actually happen, but if, as I think we're both confident, Mr. Putin does want to have a fourth phase that terminates the war smartly, if not decisively, then what would actually achieve that? So we're not talking about what will happen, but what both of us, mostly you think, would be required to actually achieve a decisive operation.
Well, I think it's important to go back and remember that there was never any intention whatsoever to conquer all of Ukraine.
Right.
Remember, this place is the size of Texas. And to be perfectly frank, the Russians really don't want to have to manage millions of Western Ukrainians who have absolutely no desire to live under Russian rule or government.
Right.
They never did. In fact, Putin, in a speech given back in 2015 or 16, it was sort of a statement he made during a question and answer period. I think it was in St. Petersburg. Somebody asked him, well, what about the Western Ukrainians and what do you think they want and so forth? He said, well, let's be frank. They'd probably be happier under Polish administration than they would be under our administration.
Right.
Didn't bother him in the least. I think what he wants is a clear, unambiguous outcome. Ukrainian armed forces are gone.
Right.
They're devastated, unambiguously defeated. This government in Kiev is gone.
Right.
It's vanishing. Either it is moved to Poland or it is being destroyed.
Yeah.
And that's the first condition. Then the next thing is, well, we're going to redraw this map. Now, I think he would prefer to negotiate over some of that. He would like to have a partner, a strategic partner. But if he has to redraw it, I think he's likely to simply say the Dnieper River is now the western boundary of Russia. I think that's his inclination. And I think at the moment it's the inclination because his fear is, well, let's assume we just take the southern areas, the areas that are traditionally Russian, down to Odessa from Kharkov and call it a day.
It's a long front. It's very vulnerable.
It's vulnerable. It's a long front. And who's to say a future government is not going to try and move over that Dnieper River, build up a force on the western side or on the eastern side, and resume stupid
absolutely.
hostile operations.
That would be a classic standard revanchism, translated into endless military baiting and incessant pinpricks, if not full-scale offensives. So,
and if he takes our threats seriously,
right,
that we're going to try and turn Ukraine into some form of Afghanistan,
right.
He wants a clear boundary that he can easily defend and monitor what's going on the other side.
So right now, the Ukrainian army has been enticed into the cauldron, a potential cauldron at Bakhmut, which, as you say, the Russians are intentionally not making into a cauldron in order to entice more. If there is an operation, let's just look, if possible, at the operational aspects. People love to draw arrows on a map, but what would be an effective operation that would not outrun itself, that would not, in the famous Clausewitzian
Not exhaust
universe,
itself.
yeah, it would not reach the culminating point of attack before achieving its objective. So what would that look like?
Well, there are three very large concentrations of Russian forces.
Okay,
You have the one in southern Ukraine, and this is beyond the troops that were there several
Right.
months ago.
right, right,
And then another concentration east of Kharkov. If you just go due east from Kharkov into
Macgregor.
western Russia, yes.
yeah, okay,
In that area, you have another concentration. And then you have a concentration now in White Russia or Belarusia.
yeah,
And that concentration is probably south of Minsk and between Minsk and maybe just north of the Ukrainian border west of Kiev.
yeah, okay.
That's where the major concentrations are. 75,000 Belarusian troops, and the Belarusians have made it clear
Right.
that they are with the Russians and the Russians are with them. But most of them are now committed to the border with Poland and Lithuania.
Just on that note, I mean, just recently, very recently, yesterday, there was a sudden surprise announcement that the Belarusian forces will be under Russian command. Is that being done simply as a way to preserve unity of command if those forces are actually launched on an offensive, or is it a way to ensure that nervous Ukrainians who are very worried about Kiev will keep a large percentage of their forces tied up against the Belarusian border?
Well, I think both of those are true. The second one is a more difficult proposition because they're down to about 190,000 effectives left
In the whole
in the
Ukrainian
Ukrainian army.
And how big are the numbers that could be unleashed in a Russian offensive?
Well, they've got over 500,000 concentrated in those three areas, and those numbers continue to grow.
And that doesn't include the Belarusian.
Right, doesn't include the Belarusians. And I think the other part of the issue is Belarusia wants the Western allies in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland to understand that an attack on them will be treated as an attack on Russia.
Right, right. I think that's
So disabuse them of some notion that they can intervene against Minsk.
so. There's powerful symbolism to have
Yeah.
this unity.
But they've also said that if the Russians strike south into northern Ukraine, that Belarusia will support that with troops.
Well, I mean, they could. There's always talk about final cutting of the rail links to whatever Ukrainian forces are still left in the east. But is it really necessary to launch a strike south from Belarus, and what would that hope to achieve? What would be the objectives?
Well, this is an interesting question because they have the potential for 2 or 3 operational axes.
Yes, exactly.
And one of the goals of this new offensive will be to permanently cut off Western Poland from Ukraine. In other words, to ensure the Ukrainians are not being supplied any longer with Western weapons over that border. And if you look at the concentration of force that's up there, in broad numbers, we've counted 1,500 tanks, 1,000 rocket artillery systems.
This isn't all three
drone systems.
concentrations,
Yeah,
is it?
it's all three. Thousands of armored fighting vehicles, thousands of conventional artillery.
Yeah.
How these are going to be distributed I'm not privileged to that. I don't know, but I see a substantial enough concentration in Belarusia that it makes sense to strike downwards,
Right.
which would be west of Kiev,
Yes.
but east of the Polish border. And if you look at the map, you can go from Belarusia down to Zhytomyr,
Right.
from Zhytomyr to Vinica,
Yes.
and it's a short stint then to Moldova.
That's
And see,
right.
Moldova is important because we've eyed Moldova repeatedly
Oh, yeah, I
as a
know.
potential jump-off point for operations against the Russians in southern Ukraine.
Plus, there's Transnistria there.
Yeah. But the bottom line, if you look at that, that's a fairly straightforward. Just by positioning the force there, now Kiev is isolated.
Well, it's somewhat ironic, but several times on Polish television, in news programs, they put up maps of a post-war settlement in which the little bit of Ukraine
Western
that is
Ukraine,
Hungarian would go back to Hungary, the little bit that's Romanian would go back to Romania, and then there are 3 oblasts,
Yeah.
which were once part of Poland until not so very long ago.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, you might have a kind of complicity between Poland and Russia, and what would be left then between the area the oblasts around Lviv would be a rump state of Ukraine, serving as a buffer, and then Russia proper.
Well, see, the nice thing about going to Zhytomyr and then down to Vinnytsia
Yeah.
is that you are not confronting a Polish military contingent.
That's true.
And if we are stupid enough to commit 30 or 40,000 U.S. troops 50 or 60 kilometers into Western Ukraine, if they sort of take that line, then they could conceivably avoid confronting us.
That's true.
I'm hopeful that we will not do that, because I would think that someone would not want to bankroll or back up Polish annexation of territory or anybody else's annexations. I mean, it's beginning to sound like Czechoslovakia in 1938.
Indeed. Well, it is on people's mind, though.
Oh, of course.
And so, what these little ironical admissions suggest or signal is that, in spite of all the rhetoric, the political rhetoric that is pushed out there, that elites are thinking seriously about a post-war settlement that does not involve the status quo ante for Ukraine, to say the least.
Well, I think it also creates the possibility that whatever settlement emerges will not include Washington.
That's true, and that's another story.
And to be frank, Washington would be smart to stay out of it. Whether or not we're smart enough to do that, I don't know. But anything that can occur without us and it offers stability in some form is probably desirable. And I'm sure from the Russian vantage point, they would be less concerned about the Polish presence, provided it did not symbolize an aggressive NATO presence.
A stalking horse for the U.S.,
yes.
in other words.
And no U.S. missiles and
Right.
so forth, so on. Now, that, of course, is a huge assumption given the Polish attitudes, which are frankly dangerous.
Well, unfortunately, I agree there. Now, Matt, just to finish out this first part, there are a series of issues that speak to profound misconceptions that Americans have about the conduct of war and operational art. And I just thought we might visit those quickly so that those watching might understand better what is actually going on. In other words, the actual dynamic of battle and the actual way in which the Russians have been performing and succeeding. And the first of those has to do with fortification. And it seems as though the assumption is that Russians cannot break through the intense fortifications that the U.S. and NATO helped the Ukrainians construct over 8 years. And they're fairly extensive. They look like the height of a trench development, pillbox, etc., development in World War I. But the assumption is that the Russians are taking horrendous losses trying to take them. And the issue, it seems to me, is that Americans don't seem to understand that fortifications can delay an offensive, but they can't stop an offensive. Maybe you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, this is something that came up early on. I think we have a very light infantry-centric leadership in NATO.
That's important.
Because of the last 20 years of light infantry operations against very weak insurgents. The British fall into this category naturally, given their imperial past.
Yes.
The French also, although the French, to their credit, I think, have largely stayed out of this, at least in physical terms on the ground. I think the idea of a fortification is appealing because there's an assumption that if you place forces inside a city, everyone has to stop to remove them. Right. But in reality, the opposite is the case. If you are kind enough to immobilize yourself, the enemy is probably going to respect your decision to immobilize yourself and will eagerly surround you, cut off your water, cut off your food, whatever sustenance. You will run out of ammunition, and then you have a choice. You can either surrender or be annihilated while the main body of the force moves on to other locations. This was the sort of Hitlerian approach in World War II. Let's have fortified places, and the Soviet armies will have to stop. No, Soviet armies didn't stop.
That shows at the end of the war in Kurland, for example.
Sure.
You had a whole German army just uselessly boxed in.
Yeah. So I think this is a huge problem for us because it undermines all our assumptions about how we want to fight in the future. The second thing is, we think we found a new technology that will destroy tanks. Well, you've got lots of technologies and have always had them to destroy tanks.
Oh, totally.
It's like minefields. We've always had minefields, millions of mines all over Eastern Europe during World War II, North Africa. It's not a new phenomenon.
Tank begat anti-tank
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
immediately.
of course.
So, yeah,
But what people learn to do is to partner these capabilities with other capabilities that are designed to protect them or enhance them.
right.
And so you may see a change in the balance. Instead of 100 tanks, there may only be 50 in the future and more of something else.
Right.
But the bottom line is that you end up with a different construct that's designed to exploit that strike capability thanks to ISR. So instead of sitting and waiting for something to happen, you are now moving through the ISR strike
Right.
environment.
Well, this is what has struck me so much about the war in Donbass, where you have this World War I-like buildup of fortification, and how essentially passive the Ukrainians have been. Or if they're not passive, they're like little attacks in World War I. They're suicidal.
Well, they started with very large-scale counteroffensives, 50, 60,000 troops.
Yes.
They've been cut down to company-size elements, relentlessly being hurled against these defenses, which again, as we pointed out, is the Russians have welcomed this, but it has been detrimental to the Ukrainian war effort.
Well, the corollary to talking about fortification, thus, is to talk about fires. And Americans have a completely cartoon-like understanding from the Soviet days, but also just in their head, that somehow Russian fires are massive but indiscriminate, and because they can't be precisely or promptly targeted, are not achieving their goals. And I just would like you to clear up the Russian approach to and success with fires in this war.
The first thing we have to understand is the monopoly on the microcircuitry that was essential to precision
Right.
that we enjoyed in 1991 is gone.
Right.
Soon after the turn of the century, that microcircuitry found its way into Russia and China and elsewhere. The Russians, the Chinese, and anybody that cares to buy their equipment, obviously, now has the ability to attack precisely any point that they can identify, provided they have the range with a weapon system.
Yep.
So the Russians now have the ability to deliver accurate, devastating firepower with enormous precision,
Yeah.
to the point that immobilizing yourself or sitting still for any great length of time is very dangerous. Now, if you can disappear under 20 feet of concrete or something temporarily, you may survive for a while.
Right.
But it's not a long-term solution. The only long-term solution is some degree of protected mobility, integrated air defenses, and the Russians have demonstrated that their integrated air defenses have been marvelously effective, shooting down things like HIMARS missiles,
Yes.
which we didn't expect.
Absolutely not. And we didn't expect the Iranian cheap but deadly drones either.
That's right.
We thought all innovation is ours.
But clearly, Russia has moved from let's fight this on the cheap
Yeah.
to we're now going to win it and dictate the terms under which we will live in the future in Eastern Europe.
Right.
That's where we're headed. And that's when you begin to look at these axes, where could they go? Well, clearly the ideal way to handle Ukrainian defenses is to attack them from behind. I would be very surprised if that did not happen, because you have enough forces on the western side, on the eastern side of Kharkov,
Right.
that could easily come across and turn south.
You were saying that the Ukraine on Kharkov, facing Belgorod,
Yeah.
has a very thin screen right now.
Well, it
of
did.
forces.
It did. And they abandoned it. That's why they abandoned it. They had 2,000 men,
Oh,
and they just simply abandoned Kharkov, that entire corridor, all the way down to the river. But my point is they now have a large concentration facing that. That could conceivably be channeled over the river and back into Ukraine. But instead of going north, which is what people would think, oh, we're going to Kiev, no. It turns south. And it meets the other concentration coming up from the south.
well, let's talk about that. In a
And
sense,
let me finish one thing
sure,
here.
Sure.
These two things I think will happen.
Right.
The real question is what happens in Belarus. And that concentration, if it comes down, it could have the effect that Incheon did.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't remember that what was nice about Incheon was not simply we struck where the enemy was weak, but they were positioned in such a way that the North Korean forces had to retreat. They realized their position was hopeless and started rushing northward for fear that they would be encircled and destroyed. And I think it could make a lot of sense for the
Yeah.
Russians to do something similar,
catch the
and then everyone runs north on the east side of the river to get out of the trap.
Well, the examples we have from history, because now we've gotten into the dynamic that follows fortification and effective fires, and that's the maneuver that occurs after you break through. And essentially, the war has in many ways resembled, since, say, April, a siege in the Donbass, or elsewhere as well, all along this 1,100-kilometer front. Now, Americans have assumed that this has to be a Russian breakout, that somehow they have to break through. And because of the distraction, say, of Bakhmut, there is this assumption that the Russians are going to have to bleed themselves white trying to break through the Ukrainian front. Now, you've just laid out ways in which they could get around that. And it also suggests some examples from history where the Gustav Line had held us at the top of Neapolitan Italy. And finally, even though we had a terrible time breaking out, we finally broke out from Anzio, and boom, immediately got to Rome, and the Germans had to retreat to the north. Same with the breakout in Normandy. But what you're suggesting is the conditions for breakout are not so demanding now, A, because the Ukrainian army is much less effective and much weakened, and also that there are areas where a breakthrough would not be that hard. And what I'd like to ask you is, if you could have a breakthrough, say, from Belgorod or from south of Minsk, what would the forces in the south, in the Zaporizhian area, would they try and break through what are strong defenses, or just hold the Ukrainians?
Again, if they can attack simultaneously or near simultaneously from both sides,
Everything will crack.
then it will fall apart quickly.
I see, yeah.
Listen, no one should diminish in any way the fighting skills and power of the Ukrainians. Ukrainians were always good soldiers. They were good soldiers under
Their
the Tsars.
casualties attest to that.
Yeah, and they were good soldiers in the Wehrmacht,
Yes.
and they were good soldiers in the Soviet Army. So I think that's nonsensical. But you can only expect so much from any human being.
Right.
These people have been exhausted. They've been bled white, and they don't have the experienced cadre they once had. You know, by October of 1943, the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, had lost 55,000 officers.
That's stunning.
That's incomprehensible. That means that most of the talent, not all of it, but most of the talent, particularly at the lowest level, these are the people that ran all over Europe for years.
That's right.
They were gone, or they were wounded. And as a result, the German army's offensive striking power after the fall of 43 is dramatically reduced and, quite frankly, inadequate. I think the Ukrainians are in a similar position right now.
Well, when the Russians do launch, will have to be a maneuver offensive to carry out and exploit and reach their goals. Have the Russians adapted in ways that will, in terms of their combat unit organization and in terms of the manner of how the offensive will unfold, sort of leave behind the unwieldy kind of organizational structure of divisions and corps and armies that most Americans think of in terms of maneuver.
Well, they really already have. When they went through a series of reforms, you ended up with the vast majority were in what I would call large mobile brigade groups. These are usually 5,000 to 6,000, sometimes 4,000 to 5,000, sometimes 3,000. Depends on whether this is a tank-heavy operation or mostly motorized infantry or mechanized infantry. They do have motorized rifle divisions. They are 8,000 men strong. They're the largest formations in the Russian army, but they have been used primarily as assembly areas. In other words, bring it in and then commit it to other formations to fight, as opposed to sending in a division-sized unit. All of these formations are commanded by generals. And what we did see, even with the battalion tactical groups, which was a new innovative approach, which had some merit. I think RUSI is saying the Russians have abandoned it. I'd be surprised if that were the case, but they're the only ones saying it. But they did have situations where they had one of these brigade group headquarters that was managing 7 or 8 of these battalion tactical groups simultaneously. We're much more rigid in our thinking as we were in 1942, 43,
Yeah.
and 44. So it's incomprehensible that we would do business that way. But the Russians, even towards the end of the war, would have as many as 7 to 10 divisions under one army headquarters, which was a corps equivalent. Unthinkable for us.
That's right.
But it gained enormous ground quickly.
So
It-
you have generals commanding brigades then
Yes.
in Russia.
Yeah.
That's something that you don't have in the US.
Well, the British Army does. The British
Right,
British
but
Army
they-
has brigade battle groups, but they don't usually have more than 4
Right.
combat battalions in a brigade battle group. But the Russians are demonstrating, oh, we can do better.
That's an British.
They're more flexible and agile in this sense.